It is August 30th, 2024, and I am joined here for my first podcast with Representative Brad Paquette, my friend. We both served in the House of Representatives together. Brad is still there, serving in the 37th District. You live in Niles, great area down on the border, and it's great to have you with us here today, Brad.
Great to be with you, Senator.
So today the topic is conservatism. I think it's a term that often gets overgeneralized, overused. A lot of people use it and they don't know what it means in its proper context. So I guess you sent out a tweet was it a tweet at the time or was it a next post? I don't know. I think it was still a tweet, basically asking who Edmund Burke was, if anybody had any more information about how you could learn more. And that one little question, I know had an impact on you, had an impact on me, just ended up, affecting my life. So, can you maybe talk about that tweet and what's kind of transpired since then?
Yeah, put out that social media post. I was reading about Edmund Burke, realizing because he was writing about the French Revolution, and I'm like, holy cow, there's so much similar to our day, from 200 some years ago. And so I just was like, hey, does anyone know much about this guy, Edmund Burke? Any folks that could fill me in a little bit deeper? And then I got one response from good friend Don Cooper, who linked me up with Dr. Nelson from the Russell Kirk Center. Next week, he was in the office. He was chatting with me about, what's the same and, how, perennial Edmund Burke is and how, the things he stood for need to be stood for in future generations. And so he was there and asked me if I knew who Russell Kirk was. I'm like, I have no idea who Russell Kirk is. And now I've got his mug. You do too. And in no way is that
Brought
depressing.
it out for this interview today.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. And using, like you mentioned, using the word conservative, I've tossed that out many times, and I didn't fully understand what it meant. And I like to know what words mean, and I know you do too. And that's why I respect you greatly, and you're a good friend of mine. And we get to have these types of discussions and podcasts together.
Yeah, and you had actually, after having that conversation with Dr. Jeff Nelson, you had set up a conference at the Russell Kirk Center up in Mecosta. Um, and there was pre-reading we had to do to prepare for that. It was quite the intellectual experience. One of the things we had to read was Burke and his reflections on the French Revolution. And I always heard about the French Revolution, but I guess I never really read that in depth from you know I guess like someone who was there at the time, really reflecting on it. And there were so many similarities to today. Um, it surprised me. I guess I never really thought in the French Revolution they were throwing away their entire society and trying to rebuild a new one. And to see a culture that had really grown over centuries, and by no means was it perfect. If you read de Tocqueville talking about the old regime, they had many issues, but instead of reforming, they went with revolution. And there's just a lot of parallels with that today. There's a real risk that civilizations can self-destruct.
Yeah, and based on
Um,
that discontent, and then based on especially what people promise, those in power promise, it's compelling, and it gravitates, builds followings over the centuries, and every now and then it needs to be squashed back. It needs to be guarded against. And one of the ultimate goals of a conservative is to have that mindset and to not be swayed by it sometimes when they're tempted, which you and I get to be involved in, a lot, especially in Lansing politics, where many put out the press releases saying they fixed everything. I don't know, you've served a little bit longer than I, but if you look at all the press releases that get put out there of how many people have fixed so many things, I feel like we should be in a good spot by now. But you and I both know, in terms of working in the world of reality, there's a lot, and we have to start with ourselves first, and that's why I think it's so important to, as we've done, is reflect on what that word conservative means, conservatism. What is that? And that's why I'm very grateful for you too.
yeah, and it's kind of fitting today. There's going to be the release of the premiere, I should say, of the new Reagan movie. Maybe with that in mind, could you maybe talk a little bit more about Russell Kirk he had a big influence in the 20th century, still even today. But who was he? Where did he come from? What did he talk about? What was he known for? How did he impact Reagan and other leaders in the United States? He had a huge impact, and not many people know about him. So maybe could you kind of talk about his background a little bit?
Yeah, Kirk is a very eccentric guy, eccentric gentleman. You and I got to meet some of his family, obviously, but yeah, he wrote a book in the 50s, I think in 1952, called The Conservative Mind. This is a time where a lot of individuals that had the conservative mindset but didn't really necessarily have a label for it felt kind of lost in the wilderness, and he was able to help contribute to a frame of which conservatives could, identify themselves or to fall in and then figure out where others were in order to build a power structure, correct? So he is able to write this book, point to history, and establish these principles that could make it easy for any person to be like, okay, this makes sense. And then also to look at how they want to reform in a land where, innovation and these winds of ideology carry people to that point where let's burn it all down. Let's build our new utopia on Earth. And Kirk was this, prolific writer in all these different ways that were heavy intellectually and then also like ghost stories and things. But he was able to help provide this framework for conservatives to unite under a banner. And so he had a huge influence on Reagan, as you mentioned. And Reagan clearly read a lot of his literature, wrote a book called The American Cause, which is behind me, actually, where in the Korean War, he noted that a lot of soldiers had no idea what they were fighting for, what the American cause was. And so he was tasked with kind of reviving these, permanent things in the minds of people, Americans, that we need to preserve in order to preserve, the blessings that we were given for posterity.
Yeah, and another book that he wrote too. This is one I would encourage anyone who wants to learn more about conservatism to read. Russell Kirk's Concise Guide to Conservatism. It's actually helped me. I guess the way it helped me is that it took ideas that I had and it put them in a nice framework, if you will. I've heard like the Apostles' Creed is kind of like the frame around Christianity. Well, in some ways, for me, these 10 principles that he put is kind of like a creed. It's not a checklist. Maybe that's a good place to start with. If you compare conservatism with maybe leftist ideology, they have a checklist. You believe in X, Y, or Z, or you're not part of the group. Conservatism is much more of a broad framework of how to think. It's a disposition. So, maybe it would be good if I threw up on the screen here. Let me share screen. I'm just going to run through these 10 principles real quick. Will only take a second. Now, I did paraphrase these, so these aren't exactly Russell Kirk's words, but hopefully I got the intent behind them. So number 1, men and nation are governed by moral laws, and those laws have their origin in a wisdom that is more than human, in divine justice. Variety and diversity are characteristics of a high civilization. Justice means every man and woman have the right to what is their own, equal rights before the law, but not equality of condition. Property and freedom are inseparably connected. Power is full of danger. The good state is one in which power is checked and balanced, restricted by sound constitutions and customs. The past is the great storehouse of wisdom. Real community is governed by love and charity, not by compulsion. A variety of local voluntary associations keeps communities healthy. In foreign affairs, set the example, but not remake in its image. Men and women are not perfectible, and neither are political institutions. And then number 10, lastly, change versus reform. Slow change that reconciles with social and moral traditions is the means of conserving society. Maybe we'll just talk about a few of these. I don't think we'll have time to get through every one of them. Maybe let's just jump off with number 1. I think there's a reason why that's the first on the list. Men and women are governed by moral laws. Is that something that's lost today? What's the significance of that? If we are governed by moral laws, like how does that impact us at the legislature? I guess what are your thoughts on that, Brad?
My thoughts are I've got a lot of them, right? This is part of our role as statesmen, or aspiring statesmen, is to figure out how to make our laws as reflective of just the most just laws, right? God's laws, natural law, and try to get our laws in line. This is where I think it becomes tricky, because when, especially today, you have terminology and words being redefined based on what is good, what is right, what is true, right? These are the immortal questions of philosophy, right? And so when we're talking about what is right, that is the source. You have to have a source on which to draw from and to pour out from. And that's the challenge, because then you have a lot of different ideological slogans to try to shut you down, especially with the slogan of separation of church and state, which is kind of funny. And I don't know if you noticed, but the Dems funded a whole bunch of churches directly in the last budget, but they are churches that have certain ideologies that they uphold. And they have, the trans flag flying in their church and things like that in their DEI statements. And so they, the Dems were the first ones to always say separation of church and state, unless these churches have the political support for them, right? And so that's a curious thing. But that's what we always have to be very vigilant when we're talking about our laws, is how do they mimic, the just laws, the natural law, God's law.
Yeah, and it is a balance, because I guess Cicero put it best when he said, "True law is right reason in accordance with nature." There's a moral law that was given to us, and not one that we can create. And when societies have tried to create their own moral laws, it's caused pain and suffering. So it's one of those things where when you let go and try to live within the bounds of the nature that we've been established, it kind of will produce human flourishing. It produces goodness. I think I just was reading a book called Christian Reflections that C.S. Lewis. It's a collection of writings that he had. I actually just read his space science fiction trilogy, which was pretty interesting. I'd heard horrible reviews of that, and it was actually, I thought it was fairly good. But he talks about how, like, it'd be like the 1940s and 50s, in American science fiction, whenever they'd go meet extraterrestrials or whatever, the only thing that was connecting them was like science-based information. So like basically math, or things that deal with with matter, with physical sciences would be the unifying principle between these extraterrestrials and humans. Well, he flipped it on its head. He said, well, I don't know if those would be the unifying principle. I think it would be the moral laws that govern us. And if you read Out of the Silent Planet, when he goes to Mars, it's the moral laws that connect the extraterrestrials with humanity, which I thought was pretty astute observation by Lewis, which I think gives more credence to what Kirk is laying out here. Are there any other of these top 10 principles that stand out to you that impact you, maybe how you govern, or just kind of your outlook on governance itself?
Yeah, well, number 5, with regard to power and how it needs to be checked and divided, I remember, especially my first term, near the end of it, I was standing on the House floor with you before we were voting to extend Governor Whitmer's emergency orders for 1 month, back in March of 2020, and we were talking about maybe voting no on that because of where it could lead, right? And anyone can remember during that time, no one knew, how bad the virus would be, and the governor probably did need to have a little extra authority at that time to, traverse the tricky situation that we were all in. But you and I
think
both
it was a 2-week extension. By the way,
yeah.
I think it was like 2 weeks. It wasn't a month. In our defense,
all I know is that the main thing is that we were talking about how it's probably not a good idea to vote to extend, and that was something that brought endearing respect from me to you, that we were able to even have that conversation when people thought that was unthinkable. But when it comes down to power, and after what we saw, and I think what we learned, a lot of what we learned about how government and those with power want more power, and it's their idea to achieve utopia, right? And they use all these different terminologies like we can't lose one, and all these different things in order to pierce our constitutional rights, which were set for a reason, right? And Dems especially like to use crisis to undermine them. And so I think number 5 is very important, especially when we're thinking about where power comes from, how it corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Getting a first-hand glimpse of that was really key. And now here we are in the midst of a lot of this as well, when the ideologies are trying to centralize power in order to achieve these political utopian visions. And we're in the thick of that right now.
Yeah, and it's easy to pick on the executive because, and I don't just mean, at the state level, even at the federal level, you see encroachment on the power of the executive at the presidency or at the state level from the governorship. But that creep, I think of the power of government as a zero-sum game. You'll see, you see it in the judiciary as well with activist judges who use that position to change laws they don't agree with rather than trying to interpret the Constitution and the laws that they are and kind of settle disputes. They're settling disputes the way they want them settled, not the way that the law says. And maybe you've seen it as well. I've seen it. When people get into leadership positions in the legislature, they'll start taking power a little too far as well. So it's kind of like the power of the ring in the Lord of the Ring. That power does tend to corrupt. That's why, in the infinite wisdom of our founding fathers, they divided our government up and had checks and balances to try to. It's a flaw in our nature, and they understood that flaw, and they understood that the best way to work against that, to prevent that from fully manifesting, is to divide everything up.
Yeah, and that's why Kirk especially points to humility, right? And then when you look to history, a conservative is to look to history. It makes you humble. You realize how small you individually are, and that you're not going to have many ideas that are going to be very new in the grand scheme of things, especially if you look at the grand scheme of things. And recognizing that first and foremost is very important. And it's easy once you get into the leadership role or you have that gavel to be like, wow, now I can change and fix everything. But that's the temptation that we can't succump to, because so many people have been doing that, and that's the average way to act in our statesmanship today.
Is there, we can probably go over one or two more. Is there another one that you wanted to discuss?
Yeah, I've always, when I first came across, some of these points that Kirk put out, the variety and diversity, are characteristics of a high civilization. I appreciate that one so much. I think it's number 2 on your screen. But when you think about, the uniqueness of an individual and what they can bring to society, and what we have today of, pixel politics, I call it, where people look at, your outward appearance, and then they say, well, you fit into this group. You're part of this group. You need to vote this way. You need to subscribe to what, this bigger picture thinks for you. And there's a complete assault on diversity and variety, being brought up and exalted, and that happens in our education system. It happens in our policies with DEI, over the top SEL, all these things that are coming to the forefront, making people subscribe just to their little pixel, and that's all they can be in the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is communism. And I'm very, in tune with that one now, and trying to figure out, well, how do you communicate otherwise in this full-on assault on real variety and diversity, in our great country?
Yeah, and I think what you're hitting on there is ideology. So, and I don't want to put all Democrats in the same boat here, but I do want to put progressive leftist ideology in one boat, because what you're saying is that's like conformity. They want conformity. They want uniformity of thought, and I see it manifested. Yeah, I see it manifested in the legislature. You look at Republicans, over my career, how often they don't vote together. We'll have almost half the caucus drop off on certain issues, but the Dems almost. I mean, you might get 1 or 2 members at times to vote off, but especially look at the Senate this year. I don't think I've seen a single senator vote against the caucus the entire term so far that I can think of. I could be off, but boy, if it's happened, we're talking single digits amount of times.
And that's a pity. And again, that's the grip of ideology on individuals who guaranteed they're campaigning, they're telling people, I'm going out there to, buck the system, and I'm not to, I'm gonna tell those lobbyists and those, rich, high-powered folks who control things, I'm gonna tell them no. And first thing they do is say yes, 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 yes.
So
Tell me
maybe
give me my orders.
what's the juxtaposition between ideology and conservatism? Like, what's an ideology, and how does that relate to conservatism?
How does it relate? Well, the simplest way I think conservatism is defined, and Kirk puts it out there and refers to someone else, is it's a negation of ideology, right? And so when you think about a negation of ideology, you have to first identify what the ideologies are. And the left and the right both have plenty of ideologies swirling, right? And that's something that you got to identify them first. And there are plenty out there. For me, I think one of the first ones is like, oh, I need to ascribe to all these different policy issues of the Republican Party. Like that's what makes me a conservative. And well, you're probably going to adhere to certain policies, especially based on the moral law. Point number one, that the Republican Party does uphold a lot of times. But you have to understand that, oh, well, being a conservative isn't just one policy or how many policies I agree with or I stand for. But what do you think?
Yeah, it's a disposition. It's an outlook. Maybe we can talk about what an ideology is a little bit more. I guess I think of it best as if you take something that's generally true and turn it into and try to turn it into an absolute, then that becomes an ideology. And this is not only a left issue. This is a left and right issue.
Yeah.
You want an example of the right? You could look at neocons. They had an ideology that America is great, and our system of government would be awesome if it was replicated everywhere else. And it's like, well, that violates the principle of variety and diversity. Like, every culture has different circumstances. So that's an ideology that's impacted the right over time. The left is, obviously, if you look at a lot of the woke stuff that you see today, that is a huge glaring example for today. You want a historical example? I think the best one is the French Revolution, where they had an ideology of liberty, fraternity, and equality. Those are all really good things in general principle, and they tried turning it into an absolute. And this is what Kirk will talk about, like the permanent things, like truth, beauty, goodness. Those are all permanent things that are good in and of themselves. But if you try to do that with liberty, you end up with a lack of justice, because if everybody's doing everything they want without considering the impact on their fellow man, you end up marching Carmelite nuns to the guillotine. Like it doesn't work. So with that in mind, of thinking what ideology is, the gentleman H. Stuart Hughes, who Kirk quoted, I think hit the nail on the head with conservatism. It is the negation of all of that. It's trying to take all the information we have, and then working within the bounds of the human condition, and trying to have the best society we can have, given our fallen nature.
Yeah, and one of the big pieces too on ideology that we're seeing that doesn't necessarily have a name is that a lot of people are viewing government as God, as the complete arbiter of all things, making all things better and all things right in every way. And that is, I don't know if there's a term for that ideology yet, but the left and the right both succumb to that at times where, I felt it too, where and you've had probably constituents that have had issues, and it's like, well, how do we go fix this for this person? And that's a very, very dangerous one, I think, because many people in politics, their job, they want to make everyone happy. They want to be liked by everyone. And that's, I think, why we've gone down the road so far toward serfdom, in my opinion. But, in centralized planning and things that, Hayek wrote about, is because a lot of us in positions where we have these votes or these opportunities to reform policy or change policy or to innovate, we want to make everything right and everyone happy, and that's that utopian striving, right? And so that's, again, one of the things that need to be negated when we talk about operating in the realm of reality that Kirk mentions, so well, too.
Yeah, it can be hard when you have someone who comes and talks to you, and they have a horrible tragedy that's happened in their life, and they want the government to step in and help out. There can be time for that, absolutely. But there are times where I'm sorry, that is horrible what happened, but it there's not really, the government can't prevent all tragedies from happening. It's an unfortunate
Yeah.
reality. Um,
And another big
one
one
of
that's popping
yeah,
up too is medically assisted suicide,
yeah,
where opening that door is, I had a constituent that was speaking with me about how that's what she wants to choose if she so could, and that's what ultimate liberty is, ultimate freedom is. A conservative should back that. And if you really step back and you pick apart that argument and think about the government's role, preserving life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, it runs very contrary, as you mentioned with the French Revolution and liberty is, yeah, if you go too far down that road, you're going to be going into some dark places.
yeah. I think what she meant is libertarians should support that. That's that's more of a libertarian, view of extreme liberty. People should be able to do whatever they want. That's not. Hopefully, that helps explain the difference between conservatism and libertarianism. That, I think, assisted suicide might be the best example of a wedge point between the two, systems of thought. One other thing I was hoping to talk about was the last point, because I think this one had a huge impact on me, and it was change versus reform. Because I think I always kind of had this thought going into the legislature. Obviously I knew I was conservative, but I always kind of felt um, this urge that, yeah, I do want to reform that, I want to change that, but there's something holding me back. I feel like as a conservative, I should try to keep things consistent. Um, this is the one that actually helped me reconcile that, because it's like, yeah, as time moves on, things change, circumstances change, and it's okay to reform things and make them better, which is complete common sense. But having that on the list I think it had a big impact on me. And there's also been times where I've tried to change things, um, and I have fallen short, and I have only been able to make what I would describe at the time incremental changes. Kind of, I wanted to do five things, I only got three of them done, so I felt kind of disappointed. But it's actually kind of a relief. It's like, that's fine. Slow change is okay, and just do what you can. And as time moves on, just keep making changes around the edges. You compare that to the left's ideology. They see the world as not the way it could be. They just want to tear it down. It's like, well, what do you want to rebuild? It's like, well, we'll figure that out later. We just know that what we have now is not perfect. It's like, well, yikes, that's scary that people actually want to do that kind of stuff.
Well, that's a big point, and I'm grateful for you, especially when you were chairing the budget. I was able to chair the subcommittee on education, and I was a former teacher. I fell into teaching in a strange way. I wasn't meant to be a teacher, and I fell into a project-based learning school that was completely, we use the word innovative all the time, and we were changing the game in a lot of ways for the better for kids learning and for enriching kids and getting them excited about delving into history and meeting high standards in writing and reading. And so I came into the legislature looking to really at first tear down a lot of what was keeping innovative teachers from thriving. And I had to rein myself in a little bit. Even one of our the budgets, I gave a little speech on there. I referred to Burke and talked about really raging against the machine and how we got to upend everything. And it really comes down to reforming incremental reform from within. And that's a tough one, especially as the education conversation is very passionate. But many of us are really, really excited to tear certain things down, whether it be the State Board of Ed or the Federal Department of Education. And sometimes taking a little pause and looking at that is important. But yeah, that's going to be a force coming to a head, especially when we talk about education, because it's been going down this path of doing such a disservice to young people for a very long time. And that makes a lot of us angry in the education world. But it's coming to a head, especially after what we saw with coronavirus and how parents are very disillusioned with our system right now. So there's got to be some real reform that we need to spearhead in that area for sure.
Yeah, and actually, if you're not open to taking that incremental reform, it can make things harder. I've dealt with members in the past who would vote no on everything, and then they would go around and say I'm the most conservative member, I vote no the most. It's like, well, that doesn't make any sense if you just vote no on everything. Like there's a viewpoint that gets, I think it gets pushed out in the media as well. Like the most obstinate person is the most conservative person. It's like, well, no, you're missing the point that that's not in the essence of what conservatism is. Conservatism's open to making, reforms and looking at the whole picture and trying to make the most prudent, decisions possible.
Yeah, and that's why I think Kirk is so important, and these conversations are so important because, when you look to that type of wisdom, it allows you to really, really become a better legislator. Like you mentioned, yeah, that's a very difficult thing when someone just wants to be obstinate, and that's what conservatism is. It's like, no, that's absolutely not what it is. And so,
Yeah,
flipping that script is
well,
key.
hopefully we can make a little bit of a difference here, at least hopefully shedding some light on what conservatism is. And I just, I really appreciate you, Brad. It's an honor to serve with you. You know, it's kind of sad we're not in the same chamber anymore, but I still get to work with you. Still in the fight. Thank you for sending out that one tweet asking who Edmund Burke was. It had a big impact on me, so I very much appreciate it. But anyway,
No,
well, God bless
absolutely.
you, Brad. Appreciate your time,
Yeah.
and hope
Well,
to
on
do
a
this
last
again
note too,
sometime.
bud. Yeah, well, on the last note too, I believe in Providence with a capital P. Meeting people, whether it be from that tweet, what it led on to, and all the great people that are out there willing to help and to advise and give just genuine good wisdom and to lend a hand, and understanding. You're one of those people that I'm so grateful I was able to meet and still continue to serve with. So, everything happens for a reason. The good Lord, puts people in place, and for whatever time that he has them together or whatever they're going to be working on, it's to his glory. And so very grateful for you. You're such a good dude, and yeah, appreciate your friendship, my friend.
Yeah, same here, and I can't thank you enough. And God bless, and take care. And we'll see you
Alrighty,
next time. We'll do this again.
sounds great.